Beth. So I've noticed that a lot of you are struggling with the concept of the imperfect and the preterit and how those function in the past. So I decided to make this little video to talk a little bit about how you know something is an imperfect, how you know something is a preterit, and how you tell the difference between those things in the past and why that's so tricky for you as an English speaker. So in English, right, whenever we're talking about past actions, we will say things like, I went, I was, I did, I worked, right? We're gonna use the ED, right, often to indicate that we've done an action in the past tense. So one of the reasons why you will find as an English speaker the preterit and the imperfect to be so confusing is because in English we would say, I worked all the time, or we would say, I worked last Wednesday, but in Spanish, that worked would be different based on the frequency of the action and the implication of whether the action was habitual, in process, or singular, or finished in the past. So in English, we don't really have a context for this. As you have seen me say, maybe in other things that you have done, right? There are 5 different ways to talk about activities in the past. So that's a lot of different ways to talk about the past, right? There are a lot of different ways we can talk about the past in Spanish. And in English, oftentimes, we're just going to use one. We would just use the word worked, right? Or we would say, I have worked. We might say I have been working, right? But we're generally going to use the same kind of, kind of functioning of words. We're going to add words to indicate elements of whether that working was conditional or whether that working is still continuing on in the present, whether or not that working was habitual, whether or not the working only happened just the one time. Or you might add words in there to tell us that that has been the case. In Spanish, unfortunately, it doesn't function like this at all, right? Remember that Spanish is a language that has more one-to-one significance. I'll give you an example in something very small, right? In English, we would say, I need you to trust in me. Or we might also say, I'm gonna put my trust in you. But we would still use that same verb, right? We would still just use the verb trust. However, in Spanish, there are actually 2 different verbs to indicate whether someone is putting their trust in you, whether you're saying, you have to trust in me, fiarse de alguien, or whether you are putting trust in someone else, confiar en alguien. So actually, there are 2 different verbs to indicate the specificity of where the trust is being placed. That's how specific Spanish is in comparison to how kind of broad and general English tends to be. So one of the reasons why students struggle with the difference between the imperfect and the preterit is because that's not at all how it functions in English, where we would just add words to indicate different tenses. Some of you have struggled with putting in things like the conditional, or the plus perfect, right? Or the pluscuamperfecto, or even adding a subjunctive in the past tense. All of those tenses are different, and they indicate something different about the type of past tense that you're talking about. Now, the only types of past tense that we will learn in this class is the preterit and the imperfect. So those are the only 2 types that you will be expected to know the difference in and how they work in Spanish. Now, when we're talking about past events, we can talk about 2 different types of past events. We're going to talk about either imperfect past events or preterit past events. Now, we didn't know, because we learned preterit first because it was the more complicated of the 2, that sometimes when we are, or all the time when we are using the preterit, we are indicating that either that action was a singular action that occurred in the past or a part of a series of singular actions. For example, if I went to the doctor last Wednesday, but I haven't been since, it's a singular action. It only happened just the one time in the past tense that I'm thinking of. When I went to the doctor, maybe He took my temperature. He asked me to cough. He looked at my breathing. But he only did those events one time each. So those would be considered maybe like a series of singular actions. If you were telling a friend, I went to the doctor, he said to me, or he asked me to cough, he asked me to breathe, he listened to my breathing, he took my temperature. That would be a series of singular actions, right? Or a singular action. So without realizing it, whenever you were using the preterite, you were indicating that it was a singular action or it was an event, saying that it had a definite beginning and end in the past. For example, if you took a vacation to Bali and that vacation happened last year, then that was an event that began and ended in the past, right? It started in the past, it ended in the past. You're back from Bali, obviously, and your vacation was only 2 weeks long, so it began and ended in the past. So you would talk about it in the preterite. If you studied a degree, for example, and you became a lawyer, that period of study was an event that had a definite beginning and ending in the past. You started it, you stopped it, now you're a lawyer, you've taken the bar, that process is over, right? So anything that could comprise a series of days or even years, but it definitely is still over in this moment in time. It doesn't have any bearing on the present, okay? And when we're telling stories, anytime we talk about a main action or a large action, that action is always going to take place in the preterite. On the other hand, when we're thinking about the imperfect, anytime a habitual or repeated action occurred in the past, we're going to use the imperfect. Here's an example. Let's say whenever you were 8, you went to go live with your grandparents. And while you were there with your grandparents, your grandpa took you to the movies every Tuesday for the entire summer, right? Now, it's not happening now, but for that summer, it was a habitual, repeated action. Every Tuesday, you and your grandpa went to the movies for that summer whenever you were 8 years old. If, for example, you like to dye your hair pink, and you did it multiple times between the ages of 12 and 16, that would be a habitual, repeated action in the past. If you were studying for an exam, and you studied last Wednesday, then you studied again Saturday, then you studied again Sunday, then you studied Monday, right? Preparing for the test. That's a habitual and repeated action that you did in the past. If every Wednesday night you always cook dinner for your family and they come over and they eat with you, that is a habitual and repeated action in the past. Actions that only happen one time would talk with a preterite, but those actions that occur multiple times like a habit in the past are always going to use the imperfect. Actions that are in process still in the present. So if you were studying to become an attorney and you haven't finished your schooling yet, it's an action that is still left open in the present, and you would use the imperfect to talk about it. If, for example, you saw your coworker last Wednesday and they were sick, and you don't know whether or not they're well or not in the present, that's an action that was an action in process in the past. You don't know if it's finished in the present, so you would use the imperfect to talk about it. Background action would always be in the imperfect. So if you're saying, when I was 11, I went to the store with my mother. When I was 11 is a background action. I went to the store is the main action. So the background action, when I was 11, would take place in the imperfect. I went to the store is the main action, so that takes place in the preterite. And finally, descriptions would almost always take place in the imperfect. So one of the things that has been been tricky for y'all is to learn the difference between the endings of the preterite and the endings of the imperfect. This is probably because if I use the word worked, it's worked. Whether I use the imperfect or whether I use the preterite in English, it's still the same. If I say I studied all night last night and Tuesday and Wednesday, or you could say I studied Wednesday. In Spanish, one of those would use the preterite and the other would use the imperfect. But in English, they're the same word. And that's part of why you're finding this section to be a little challenging and confusing. But remember that that is common with Romance languages, for example, like Spanish, where there's just much more one-to-one meaning and much more specificity embedded inside the context of the language. So how do I know that I'm in a preterite? I know that I'm in a preterite whenever I see these endings right here. These endings tell me I'm in the past, I'm in a preterite past, and I have this type of verb, right? That's what those endings tell me. So whenever I see that ending, it's going to imply something about the action that I'm doing. If I see these endings, it's implying that action was an event, a singular action, a main action. Do you see what I mean? If I use the imperfect tense, here are the endings of the imperfect, I know I'm in the imperfect because I have aba, 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 or ia, 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 ias, right? I have those endings. And that tells me I'm in the past, but I'm not in any past. I'm in an imperfect past in Spanish. And because I'm in an imperfect past, that tells me something about the action I'm talking about. It tells me I did that action in a habitual or repeated way, or that that action is still in process in the present. I was worried that if I put the phone back too far that you wouldn't be able to see the chalkboard, so I took a minute to move it. I want to give an example of how in Spanish we would transition seamlessly between the imperfect and the preterite whenever we are talking about past events. Here is an example. This is a story that I made up, right, to talk about. Un verano, cuando tenía 11 años, fui a Disneylandia con mi familia. Here, I know this is an imperfect because I have an ia. So I know I'm in the imperfect. And see, this is a background action. So that is what that imperfect is implying. That this is the sentence that is setting up the main action, which is fui a Disneylandia con mi familia. I know that this is a preterite because fui in the imperfect is iba. Yeah? So I'm saying, right, one summer when I was 11, I went to Disneyland with my family, right? So background action, main action. Caminábamos mucho en el parque. I know that I'm in an imperfect because I have this aba here, right? So I'm in an imperfect. By using the imperfect in this sentence, caminábamos mucho en el parque, I'm saying I didn't just walk one time around the park with my family. I walked repeated times around the park with my family. If I had said, caminamos mucho en el parque, I would be implying we only went around the park one time. Okay, does that make sense? Here again, montábamos todas las montañas rusas. Here, right, I have an aba. So if I have an aba or an ia, I know I'm in the imperfect. So I'm in the imperfect because I'm saying we rode all of the rides, right? Montañas rusas is the word for, what's that word in English? Roller coasters. So here I'm saying we didn't just ride those rides one time, right? We went through and we rode them multiple times, more than once, right? It was something that we did habitual and repeatedly whenever we were in the park. If I had said montamos todas las montañas rusas, I might be implying that we did it just the one time, as opposed to what I'm trying to say, which is that when we were in the park, we walked around a bunch of times and we rode all the rides multiple times, right? That's what I want to say, so I have to use the imperfect to imply that I did it more than one time. Here, comimos en el restaurante. I have an imperfect, right? I know that because there's no aba and there's no ia, and I have an imperfect ending, or I have a preterite ending here, I'm sorry. I have a preterite ending. So I know that I'm in the preterite. I'm saying we ate in the restaurant. Well, it's likely whenever you eat in a restaurant, especially in a place that's really expensive like Disneyland, you probably only went just the one time, right? So by using the preterite, I'm saying we only went to eat in the restaurant just the one time. And here, right, I say nos divertimos mucho. We had a lot of fun, right? So we had a lot of fun, implying during that event, we had fun during that event, right? So I use a preterite to indicate I'm talking about the event. If I said nos divertíamos mucho, that's an imperfect. And I know that because I got an ia. If I said nos divertíamos mucho, instead of saying we had fun during that event, which is what I'm implying by using the preterite, I would instead be saying we had fun repeatedly, entirely during the whole day that we were there. We were having lots of fun. I'd be implying that fun was had over multiple points during the day, as opposed to what I'm saying now, which is the whole event, that the event taken as a whole was interesting, or it was a fun time. When we're telling stories in the past, in Spanish, we will vacillate very easily between the preterite and the imperfect without really stopping to wonder why we're using one or the other. But using one over the other does create an implication. Now, one thing that is helpful for you is that oftentimes in Spanish, there are time markers to indicate whether or not you would use the preterite or the imperfect. I've given some examples here of when a time marker can indicate to us whether or not we would use the preterite or the imperfect. Here, I say, mi mamá habla todos los días, todos los días con mis tías. Well, I have here, todos los días. So that means all the days. When I talk to someone all the days, obviously that is a habitual and repeated action. And so I would have to use the imperfect. So I would take off the AR, write the root, and I would use an imperfect ending, which is aba, right? Mi mamá hablaba todos los días con mis tías, right? And I'm saying that was a habitual action. I know it's a habitual action because I have all of the days right here. The next one says, el año pasado tú visitarás México. Here, I have written el año pasado. That means last year. So I'm not saying every year you went to Mexico. I'm not saying multiple times you've gone to Mexico. When did you go to Mexico? You went once and you went last year. That could either be a singular action or an event. Either, right? It would qualify. So I know that because I'm saying it happened one time in the past that I have to use a preterite. So I would take off the AR and I would put on a preterite ending, right? Tú visitaste a México. In the next one I've written, todos los inviernos yo pasar mis vacaciones en Perú. Here again, I've written todos, right? Meaning all. All. So this is how in Spanish we would say every, right? Every winter, we would say todos. So if I did it all of the winters, then I've done it habitually. I've done it repeatedly. So I know then I must be using an imperfect. If I use an imperfect, right, then I'm going to take off the AR and I'm going to put the root down and then I'm going to add the imperfect ending, which in this case, right, is going to be an aba. So yo pasaba mis vacaciones en Perú, right? Meaning I didn't just do it one time, but I did it multiple times. Here again, right, we have a time marker and it says el jueves pasado. This is last Thursday. It doesn't say todos los jueves, every Thursday. It just says last Thursday. So if it just happened one Thursday, then it was just one day, and it's a singular action, which means it's definitely a preterit. So I'm going to take off the ER, C-O-M, right? And I'm going to put on the ER ending for preterits, right? Which is Carmen comió comida costarricense. Anteayer, Tomás y Ricardo abrir sus apuntes para estudiar. Anteayer, meaning the day before yesterday, Tomás and Ricardo opened their notebook to study, or their notes to study. So anteayer is just one day, the day before yesterday. So that's implying, right, they've only really opened their notebooks to study just the one time, right, because we have the day before yesterday here. So it's only happened the one time, so we know that it has to be a preterit. So Tomás y Ricardo, and we're going to take off the IR, right, write the root, and then we'll write the correct ending. Abrieron sus apuntes para estudiar. Cada martes, mi abuelo y yo ver una película. Cada is another way of saying each, right? So here we could say each this way, or every this way, we would say each with cada. So we would be saying each Tuesday. So that's kind of saying like every Tuesday. So we're implying, right, that action occurred more than one time in the past. And if so, right, it's kind of like all the Tuesdays of a certain period of time we would do this. So then we know it has to be the imperfect, right? Because if we're doing a habitual and repeated action, we're doing it in the imperfect. So, mi abuelo y yo veíamos una película. That's one of the irregular ones that's written in the book. Muchos domingos, mi familia escuchar el sermón en la iglesia. So this is saying many Sundays. That's not all the Sundays, but still it's more than one Sunday, which means it has to be an imperfect, right? Lots of Sundays. We did it many Sundays. We did it repeated Sundays in the past. So that's a repeated action, so it has to be the imperfect. So we're going to take off the AR, write the root, and we're going to add an aba to it. Vamos, with an accent mark. Ayer yo entendí la lectura muy bien. Here, ayer means yesterday, right? Anteayer means day before yesterday. Ayer means yesterday. So, that's just one day, right? So just one day would definitely be a singular action. So, ayer yo entendí la lectura muy bien. I know that this is very kind of complex, right? But you can't use the preterite and the imperfect interchangeably. They mean very different things. And that's what's important to remember whenever we're thinking about which ending we want to put on at the end. We want to make sure that if we're using a preterite, we're using it to indicate a singular action or an event that happened in the past. and that we're only using the imperfect to talk about habitual repeated actions or actions that are still in process in the present. I hope that this has helped. When you're writing your sentences, right, it's good for you to have these little time markers there. It helps you to practice, right, to know that you're going to use one over the other. It's very important to realize that these are two very different tenses in Spanish, and so that means that they imply very different things. And so sometimes whenever you have used one over the other, it adds a very different meaning to what it is that you're trying to say. So try to make sure that you keep them straight in your mind. I know this has been a very long explanation. I hope that it has helped, and I hope that you have a great day. Bye.